Hello everyone. In this video we're going to discuss the role of culture on health and health communication. This is a huge topic and I have endeavored to kind of weave it throughout the whole course as we go through the semester, as this is one of my areas of specialty. But in that process I'm finding it difficult to distill it down into one lecture for you, but I'm going to do my best to cover what I see as the key topics for our consideration here. You should read chapter 3 in the textbook. It isn't very long, but there are some interesting examples of different perspectives on health based on some existing cultural differences. In this video, I'm going to try to cover the dynamics of these different factors and the ways in which they can influence both perceptions of health and how we should be crafting our health messages to be both culturally sensitive and relevant. Now, we should start by talking about the nature of culture. And we're going to have to be a little bit general here, but what we really want to understand about culture is how dynamic it is and how deeply it influences everyday life. The textbook leads with this kind of metaphor of culture being an iceberg, right? That you only see the surface of it and it goes much, much deeper than what we see. What we see is so shallow and often it leads to misconceptions, stereotypes, etc. If we let it. And so it's important, above all else, as we go forward, to try and be what we refer to as culturally competent. And all that really means, despite all the fancy definitions, which we'll probably get into, is trying to understand that there are different perspectives, and just because they're different doesn't mean they're better or worse, right? It doesn't mean they're automatically, oh, they're different and foreign, therefore exotic and better than how we do things here, nor does it mean, whoa, isn't that backwards, right? Um, Part of this is because our idea of health and what it is innately tied up with how we view ourselves. And how we view ourselves is innately tied up in culture, which is a dynamic and kind of subjective experience. I like to always share this quote from the renowned anthropologist Edward Hall, circa 1959, and that is that culture hides much more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Right? Not only are the influences of culture often to hidden from outsiders observing that culture, but we as people within that culture are also unaware of its profound influences that feed into our everyday. This has to do with the nature of how humans are socialized and our upbringing, and we don't notice these patterns unless we stop to think about them. So let's think about them. So here's a great definition of culture. I like this one. I keep coming back to it. This comes from an intercultural communication textbook I've taught from in the past, but I like this for a couple reasons. You're about to see why. But here's the definition: an accumulated pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by an identifiable group of people with a common history and verbal and nonverbal symbol system. Let's break that down so we can interpret it a little bit more. I've taken the liberty of color coding this, so hopefully that helps out a little bit. But let's start with this idea of it is a pattern. Right? This implies causation over time. When we talk about a pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors, this is implying that there is this pattern, is a causation is over time. And perhaps most important about the dimension of time is that helps us recognize that values, beliefs, and behaviors are dynamic by nature. By that I mean they change. As time progresses, cultures evolve. So that's the accumulated pattern, and I want us to take that away from that. Now, an identifiable group, we can always ask ourselves what constitutes an identifiable group of people and what is the nature of identity. We've had some time to talk about this in this class. I'm sure you've had lots of discussions in your other classes about what is identity, how we think of ourselves, and there are different kinds of identities, right? There are the identities that we avow, like I am this person. This is how I think of myself. But there's also the identity that society puts on us, which is the ascribed identity. And how does society view us? And we are a combination of many different things here. But what constitutes an identifiable group? Well, by this definition, we could argue a lot of things, right? Is our subcultural, so to speak, groups on the internet, are those really cultural groups, right? Bronies, I like to use that example too for some reason. That was kind of in vogue, or at least laughed at a couple years ago. It was like dudes who are really into My Little Ponies, right? Is that an identifiable group? If they want to be respected as such, should we respect that? Well, regardless of whether or not you respect a particular cultural group or like it or anything along those lines, those are separate considerations. But culture is the product of a group. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what constitutes an identifiable group? It could be almost anything, and people make that argument all the time. But we should probably evaluate that on a case-by-case basis in terms of the current context as does that identity group have some measurable influence over health and health behaviors and health decisions? If the answer is yes, well, then that can serve its purpose for identifying a cultural group for our purposes in terms of cultivating a appropriate message for that group. History. Lived experience shapes perceptions and increases the coherence of a group, right? Co-orientation or co-registration are some technical terms used to describe how groups or groups from anything up from dyads to huge groups coordinate their behavior and their lived experience. Co-registration in evolutionary psychology terms is talking about how over time species, an animal and their conspecifics, as they say, they live and experience together and they increase that shared understanding of the universe. So history comes in that way. When we talk about a common history, we're usually talking about something like this, right? Shared history, co-registration, shared lived experience. How much do you have in common with your peers and classmates compared to, say, your family members? If you have siblings, you've grown up together and you've experienced a lot of the same things. You're very different people, but you have that shared history. Now, last year is a shared verbal and nonverbal symbols system. A system is a means of efficiently communicating meaning. All right, this isn't just words. It is an exchange of encoding and decoding messages and meaning. Some of this is contextual, some of it's verbal, some of it is from body language and mannerisms, and these things are shared within cultures as well. And all of these things that are shared within a culture can lead to potential barriers for communication if someone is coming from outside that culture. And so this is a useful definition for us to try and recognize the complexity of culture and some factors that we can focus on to maximize the success of our health messaging. Now, for those of you more visual learners out here, here's a diagram kind of modeling what James Newlip was talking about in that previous definition. So this is a layered model of communication. You can see that you have this large circle that represents a cultural context, but then Newlip takes it forward in that intercultural communication textbook to explain that there is the microcultural context. Don't worry about that word. He just used that to describe anything from subcultures to minority cultures to anything smaller than the dominant cultural group, which might be national or global, depending on what we're talking about. So for our purposes, we'd want to think about the cultural group as America, right? Domestically, because that's what we're mostly dealing with. However, it could be larger than that, and we'll talk about some commonalities in a moment across cultures. But at any rate, you've got the cultural group, you've got microcultural context of whatever you're deciding is the subcultural group. Then you also have the environment. That could be the physical environment here. Is the communication act occurring in a coffee shop? Is it occurring on a mountaintop, in a forest, in a library, at school, in a classroom, a work environment, a hospital? The environment also shapes the communication interaction as well. Now, within that environment, you have the two individuals. You have the individual A and individual B, and they're shaped by their own perceptions of themselves and their environments, and they communicate through verbal and nonverbal symbol systems. Sometimes the nonverbal communication is deliberate, sometimes it is not. Either way, it affects the relationship. Likewise, you have the literal meaning of the words they exchange, and you also have the socio-relational environment between these two people. What kind of relationship dynamic is at play here? In the case of patient and provider communication, well, there's a power difference there, right? There is a doctor who presumably has more power, standing, whatever, and the patient who's there in a vulnerable state trying to get help. And so all of these things factor into a model of what communication is happening. And so this is James Newliff's model of intercultural communication, but you can see that this applies to pretty much any communication interaction, because based on the definition we just talked about, so many things could constitute intercultural communication, because so many different things could constitute different cultures. So if that sounds confusing, think of it this way. Is it salient in the interaction, the cultural identity, I mean, the cultural context? Since it often is, well, we're usually dealing with some form of intercultural communication. The more strangers people are, the more significance is going to be on these different layers. If you're talking to your brother or something like that, your parents, well, fewer of these factors are important because you share more context. Hopefully that helps us kind of start wrapping our head around how culture functions in health communication settings. Here's another way of looking at it. This is a discussion. This is an image coming from yet another textbook that I've taught from in the past. This was a diversity textbook. So it's a business textbook. It's called Managing Diversity, and it was about the dynamics of the workplace and basically intercultural communication there. So here they're saying there are lots of barriers to effective cross-cultural communication. So this is visualizing it a little bit differently in terms of what is the specific context in which we have to deal with these kinds of things. Well, you can see that you have two people here. One speaker is encoding a message and they're sending it to the other individual. Often communication gets broken down into this kind of transmission model. Now, effective communication has to go beyond a transmission model, but for our purposes of recognizing barriers, this is sufficient for now. One speaker encodes the message. They transmit it through verbal and nonverbal channels to the other individual, who then receives the message and decodes it into meaning in their brain. Now, you have verbal and nonverbal channels, and you have verbal and nonverbal barriers to that understanding. We've got some examples here. When it comes to verbal things, you have, for example, idioms. That could be any kind of verbal expression, a metaphor, a slang, something like that. That will impact the ability of the receiver to decode that message. So if you come from a different culture, or you're speaking English as a second language, something like that, well, expressions are a major barrier to that. So it's important to try to reduce the amount of slang that we use and expressions. I'm guilty of this too. Sometimes we don't realize that we're using expressions. Why? Because we're not always totally aware of our cultural surroundings. But if you've ever tried to speak to someone in a second language and tried to translate one of your native expressions, you're going to understand exactly what I'm talking about here. I'm trying to decide how far down this rabbit hole I could go. We could pull out some expressions. I speak Japanese. I lived in Japan for a number of years. They have a great deal of expressions that are hard for us to understand. Some of them are easier to understand. One would be the expression kuki yomenai, which they do abbreviate into English letters of KY. And that literally means unable to read the air. What does that mean? Well, it's actually directly relevant to what we're talking about, so I'm glad I arbitrarily decided this example. That means someone who's clueless, basically. But even the expression clueless in English, it's going to have slightly different connotations, but roughly translated, it means you're clueless. You're unable to read the air, unable to read in between the lines. Right? These are all expressions, and you probably have an understanding as to what they mean, but that requires a little bit more context. Therefore, you're seeing a barrier there if we're using that kind of stuff. That's just one example from this list of things. Other examples would be accent. We are stuck with the accents we have. If we learn a language after about 7 years of age. I am functionally fluent in Japanese, but I have an American accent. I overpronounce things. I put in prepositions where they shouldn't be there. I will never sound like a native natural Japanese speaker. I can be understood, but I have an accent. I have these different enunciation, emphasis in the sentence. All these things are different, so that these are barriers to my ability to communicate in my third language of Japanese. Nonverbal things. You've got tone of voice, emotional expression. We've talked about that a little bit, I assume. There are differences in affect displays. Right? This was an issue when we were talking about representation in healthcare and how doctors have difficulty decoding pain expressions across cultures, right? That The Washington Post article said, "Oh, look how," well, they implied, "Look how racist these doctors are. They think that black people have thick skin." Well, it's a little more complicated than that. The research shows that what those doctors were struggling with mostly was a cultural decoding. That seems to be what's happening. Now, we can work around this and we can work through it, and we should try to adjust that problem. However, that's an example of a nonverbal barrier to communication, and another reason why representation in healthcare matters, and so does cultural sensitivity. We don't need to go through all of these. You can use your imagination, but these are what we would consider to be cultural barriers, and they're going to get in the way of communication, which means they're going to get in the way of effective health communication. So let's get back to the textbook for a moment and think about the view of health that they bring in. They give us a couple of options. One is a medical model. The kind of biomedical perspective of health considers it to be an absence of symptoms of illness. It's kind of difficult to define something in terms of a negative, right? We're saying, well, we're not saying what health is. We're saying what it's not, right? It's not illness in terms of this medical model. And we can understand why that is, right? The textbook points out that, well, if you've got an acute issue, like a broken bone or a cranial fracture, severe bleeding, well, that you would want to stop that, right? That is an illness, that is a problem. It needs to be addressed immediately and quickly to avoid complications and death. However, that doesn't really help us conceptualize what health is. We, in Western society, often frame medicine as preventive rather than promotive. We could go down that road if we really want to. We don't have to go too far down that road, however. We think of medicine in terms of like avoiding bad outcomes instead of pursuing good outcomes. This is changing a lot in modern Western American society, I believe, and it's shifting gradually more towards what other cultures traditionally view health as, which is this state of balance. You may recall the WHO definition of health being a combination of psychological, physical, and social well-being, which is deliberately but also frustratingly vague. But if you go look at other cultures' definitions of health, you see perhaps more philosophical views, but they're at least recognizing that it's a balance, that our body is in balance, and that's what health is. So that's a very common way of thinking about health, and it's probably most useful for you to at least recognize most cultures respect that, and they appreciate that health is a balance, right? We're not always going to be completely free of illness and symptoms, but at least we can have good and bad things going on and live our lives. So we also want to consider some other cultural factors that shape our understanding of health a little bit deeper, if you'll indulge me, while we continue to think about how this is going to shape our health messaging. Before we go too much further in terms of the differences, however, I always like to pause and reflect on the fact that as different as cultures can seem when you're studying and considering all their individual perceptions, there's a lot in common. We just mentioned one. Many cultures consider health to be a unique kind of a balance, and that's an intuitive thing. What you're looking at here is what Shalom Schwartz called 10 universal values. Now, when it comes to intercultural communication, a lot of the studies have looked at how people are different. This is one of those interesting studies that was looking at how different cultures are similar, because we are, after all human, and that matters a lot. And so Schwartz investigated this in the context of trying to see what kind of values different cultures had. And so this was survey work, right? He had a whole bunch of items and questions that were intended to measure these different kinds of values, right, as abstract moral ideas. And he went and distributed them among a bunch of different cultures and compared the results. And one of the patterns he saw, in interest of time, we'll keep this short, he noticed that these 5 values, the top 3 and the bottom 2, tended to be ranked similarly across values. So he asked them, what do you think of all these different things? And then he asked them to basically prioritize which values were most important to them. And he saw some consistent patterns. They weren't always laid out this way, but most of the cultures that he surveyed did put things like self-direction, benevolence, and universalism fairly consistently in their top three. Not always in this order, but in their top three. And they also consistently ranked power and stimulation as values as their bottom two. The middle ones vary a lot, and we can talk about why that might be as well. But it's interesting to see that people, at least publicly, acknowledge that these are things that societies value: self-direction, benevolence, universalism. And these are things that societies discourage, such as power and stimulation. That's interesting and useful to us because that reminds us that as different as we seem, when we go beneath the surface down to values, we can find a lot in common, right? No matter, and I've mentioned this in the past, no matter what culture you go to, people seem to care about feeling like they have some say in their healthcare, feeling like they have some control over their health. Well, so it's not surprising when you do a study like this and people from cultures all over the world say that they value self-direction, right? So that's useful to us. Now, as for the middle five values here, achievement, hedonism, security, conformity, tradition, those tend to be ranked more differentially depending on which culture you go to. There are two possible reasons I can think of why that might be. One, the survey wasn't good enough, right? Maybe the values weren't clear enough. Maybe these values are more nuanced in the culture, and so the definitions and the things that Schwartz was trying to measure didn't quite match up with what that culture thought of those things, if that makes sense to you. Another explanation would be that these values truly are culturally mediated in terms of like, well, some cultures really think tradition is important more than others, or some cultures want to say conformity is number one. So that could be historic context, that could be cultural context, it could be true differences, it could be definitional. There's a lot of possible explanations there. Now, this isn't an intercultural class, so we're not going to go too much deeper in that, but it's interesting, and you can consider that as you like. But at the very least, recognizing that if we go a little bit below the surface of something that seems perhaps really weird that another culture does, we might find a very universal reason why they do that, and we might find some similarity between ourselves and them in that way. That's important because when it comes to cultural competence, we need to try to do some perspective taking and try to understand what we have in common with each other, not just what's different. So culture is going to shape how we view health. And that's not the only thing that shapes how we view health. We also have, sure, ethnicity. We have these other demographics. Age, of course, the textbook has a good discussion on age, gender, socioeconomic conditions, geography. I could probably give you examples of all of these, but I don't want you to fall asleep just yet. But we could consider briefly, how does geography or geographic boundaries, how does that shape our perception of health and illness? Well, it could shape our health and illness in terms of the physical environment, for instance. If your home country is very, very cold, you may not think of being exposed short of death. You may not think of exposure as particularly dangerous, right? Or as unhealthy, rather. Everyone recognizes, exposure can kill you. But maybe your culture bathes in icy rivers routinely. Who knows, right? On the other side of that scale, maybe your country has hot springs. I'll use Japan as another example. They have, it's a volcanic country. There's a lot of hot springs. Bathing has been part of Japanese culture for as long as there's been a Japan, because hot baths have always been a thing because there's always been hot springs, right? So geography feeds into the practice of, well, baths have always been available throughout Japanese history, and therefore people took baths. And so that, in turn, shapes how they view health as something like, we should take baths. Does that sound silly or obvious? Perhaps, but we don't have to go back too far to think of a time when bathing was not a very regular thing in Western culture. I don't think it was quite so egregious as pop culture makes it seem, like, oh, no one bathed in the Victoria era. Well, that's not true. People did bathe, but the views of how bathing occurs, how frequently bathing occurs, would be very different. And there's probably some geographical reasons that feed into the cultural reasons. Again, if you live in Japan over the millennia and there's always hot springs around, then that's part of it. And bathing every day would be part of your conception of health. That's just one example. I think it's kind of interesting, and I miss hot springs, so maybe that's why I brought that up. But some of these other ones are also very influential as well. We can think about gender, and we'll discuss that a little bit deeper. So gender, concepts of gender are really important in terms of how we think about self as well, and how society treats each gender, often associated with biological sex. That's going to affect health outcomes as well. Now, why am I using the word gender instead of sex? Uh, Traditional definitions, well, modern definitions, all definitions of sex and gender follow along these lines. Sex is the expression of chromosomes. It's a biological process that results in us being one of these categories or the other. There are exceptions to that rule, but that's not the point here. Gender is cultural, right? So that's why we're talking about it in this way. Gender describes cultural identity roles, which are typically associated with your biological sex, predominantly, but gender is describing how the society views those sex roles, and they construct unique roles for the different sexes and in their culture. That constructed role is what we refer to as a gender, right? So we're not talking about biological sex right now per se. We're talking about how society views biological sex and why that matters for that culture. And you can think of lots of examples why that matters. This is important in a lot of conversations about women's reproductive rights, but also women's rights in general, globally. Not all cultures treat women the same way they do, or men for that matter, in other countries. So that matters in terms of access to health information, right? If you live in a country that's has more, shall we say, strict gender roles, it's going to be harder or perhaps taboo for women or men to access certain kinds of health information. This could be, the textbook gives us some examples of where in countries where women are the primary caregivers and considered to be that core of the family, they might be hesitant to engage with certain health information that might compromise or undermine that role as the authority of health in the household. You also have other considerations in terms of, well, other cultures will limit men's role in childbirth, for instance, whereas that is seen as the realm of women and men should stay out of it, right? So the midwife and the mother are in the room, but the father is disconnected, right? So we can think of a lot of examples in terms of how a given culture will limit our access to health information based on our gender, access to resources, responses to disease in terms of how much they're stigmatized or taboo. Gender modifies things like that in terms of, are you more stigmatized if you have HIV and you're a woman, or if you're a man in a given culture, right? What is the association there? That could be different depending on the culture. The stigma and taboo associated with menstruation, right? So it's very difficult to separate biological sex and gender roles, and that's why society creates gender roles. But we want to at least distinguish between the two to recognize that each society treats biological sex and the roles they expect to be associated with biological sex differently. Now, we don't need to go down the whole list and go through the different demographics and all the possible myriad ways that they are treated differently or influencing culture. The textbook has some good examples of that, but the reason I don't want to spend too much time on that is because it is so contextual. And so when it comes to making culturally sensitive health programs, you will need to be able to take many different perspectives into account in order to be effective and competent in cultural communication. It's going to be case by case, though. So the best I can really do, rather than give you a bunch of Snapple facts about a bunch of different cultures, I want to instill in you a curiosity and an open orientation that will allow you to be more empathetic towards different individuals and try to gather information that's going to be culturally relevant. Because depending on who you're talking to, what kind of group you're aiming at, you're going to have to gather more information. This is all an argument for audience segmentation. So our messages are always going to be audience centered in nature, and we've talked about that throughout, and we're going to continue talking about it. But culture is a astronomically important factor. But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about audience-centered messages. The reason you need to get to know your audience is because you cannot presume to know everything about a culture. So we want to do our best. That's why the textbook takes this kind of social justice-y approach. Is they want us to engage with the community so we can understand them. Even if it's a community close to your own, you may not know that culture that well. It could be in the same state, but Walworth County is going to have a totally different culture than Milwaukee or Madison. Milwaukee is going to have a different culture than Madison. Madison kind of weirds me out sometimes. I go there, I'm like, this is very, very different. Feels kind of like Denver or something. But anyway, you get the idea. You don't have to travel very far to be encountering a different culture, and so we want to be audience-centered in our messaging. We want to be able to consider the roles of taboo and stigma. There's a lot of interesting literature on this. Regardless of what culture you're in, there are 3 areas that tend to be the subject of taboo, which means we don't want to talk about it. So those big 3, you could probably guess. One is sex, one is death, and the other one is excrement, right? All of those things. Every culture finds ways usually to talk about those things euphemistically because they tend to be rather taboo subjects. So while we have that in common across cultures, these things are all taboo subjects. How we talk about them, that's going to differ across in those different cultures, right? The strategy of euphemistically talking about taboo subjects, that's universal. The euphemisms are not. Right? So which culture you go to, you're going to have to learn those rules for each culture. Right? So how might cultural sensitivity influence a strategy? Well, one of those considerations is cultural competence. You can think about the role of culture and how it might influence your strategy. For instance, if you are in a culture where you do not have access to women, right? If it's taboo for you even to talk to women, how are you going to access that population if they're the primary audience? Well, you might have to go through the secondary audience. But regardless of those individual barriers that we're going to encounter based on the different cultures, cultural competence is going to be essential for meeting those goals. So how do we define cultural competence? The capacity to function effectively as an individual and or an organization within the context of the cultural beliefs, behaviors, and needs presented by consumers and their communities. Is this any more useful to us? Well, it's the definition they gave us from the textbook, so we at least want to know it. But what we're talking about in terms of cultural competence is like, can you function in a given culture? Can you be removed from your culture, placed somewhere else, and be able to survive? Well, if that happens to you, if you ever travel abroad or anything like that, you're going to quickly learn some ways to survive in that context. However, we can cultivate those skills now so that if you are dealing with a different culture, again, going back to our original consideration that most interactions are going to have a cultural component, an intercultural component, well, we can refine these skills in terms of cultural competence. Well, maybe that helps us on the individual level, but what does cultural competence look like in a health communication program or in health communication in general? Well, we want to think about health communication plans in terms of if they're well designed and well executed, they're going to do a couple of different things. They're going to rely on an in-depth understanding of intended audiences, audience segmentation and analysis, remember that, and are going to be tailored to their needs and beliefs. So going back to that definition we just looked at, they include that word needs in there in that definition. So a good health communication message that's going to be culturally competent is going to be responsive to what those people want. That may sound obvious to you, but the textbook does a good job of bringing up a lot of examples like, well, according to this different culture, they may have very different priorities. Maybe they don't want to cure a particular ailment because they think it is spiritually significant. Maybe they have different protocols for dealing with something because they have beliefs about a certain ailment being associated with the soul, right? So we will be faced with these kinds of dilemmas when engaging with cultural differences. We're going to face these kinds of ethical dilemmas. It's never as obvious as you think. And that's kind of the whole point of cultural competence, because if everything that every different culture did was totally agreeable to you, we wouldn't need to talk about this. So cultural competence means responding to the needs of that community. And sometimes that's going to mean prioritizing what they want over what you want. Um, there's not any easy answers when it comes to that, right? Preserving the health of the individual versus preserving their what you might perceive as superstitious or frivolous beliefs. But you're going to need to find a balance between the two. At the very least, we need to be sensitive to those beliefs, to those cultural contexts, and our messaging should reflect that. It may not change your actual goal, but it'll definitely change how you approach the messaging. So this means that a good health communication plan that is culturally competent is going to have group-specific messages, channels, and messengers. Who is saying the thing? Who is delivering that message? How is that message being delivered? And that's going to vary based on the groups, and that could be even the groups within that audience and that culture. So it should also include considerations for capacity building. By recognizing the needs of the community, a good health intervention is also going to be building capacity within that culture to allow those individuals to deal with these kinds of health issues in the future, to better equip them for the challenges, not just swooping in and saving the day. This isn't a superhero kind of gig. What we're doing is we're trying to build competency in ourselves, but also build capacity in the community in which we're going to work. It's also another good time for us to recognize persuasion and social influence. If we want our messaging to be effective, we have to consider things strategically. And persuasion and social influence theories are always a good way of thinking about this. We've talked about health belief model and theories along those lines, but this might be a good time for a refresher on how persuasion occurs. Most social influence theories rely on assumptions of two routes of persuasion or kinds of proof. Depending on the theory, they'll use different terminology to describe these things, but think of this in terms of kinds of evidence that are being presented in the message. One would be heuristic or cues, or what might be referred to in the elaboration likelihood model as the peripheral route of persuasion. This is things like aesthetics, credibility of the speaker, the attractiveness of the speaker, maybe scary images, beautiful images, like those kinds of things that aren't necessarily related to the content of the message. They're thus peripheral or heuristic cues. Systematic, or also known as the central route of persuasion, if we're thinking in the social influence theories, well, this has to do with logically working through things. In the elaboration likelihood model, we're talking about when an individual feels high engagement with the message, high involvement, and they're more likely to engage with the message and think about it and elaborate on it. That's what the elaboration likelihood model is. We haven't talked much about that. Don't worry too much about it, other than this is a central social influence theory. But at any rate, I do want you to note that these are two different routes of persuasion. Most social influence, modern social influence theories, like, well, they're not all that different really, because we have what's called bounded rationality to begin with. So we use a lot of cognitive shortcuts even when we think we're being very rational. That's neither here nor there. What we do want to take away from this is that there are different kinds of evidence and persuasion routes. If you want to be successful in your cultural campaign, you should be trying to leverage both, because that's going to maximize your potential for success. You can't just rely on logic and rationality as the health people were the public health people were trying to do back in the 50s or 70s, and they're driving tuberculosis x-ray trucks around, right? They're, all right, we're giving the community information. They need this information. This is a health condition that affects them. Why won't they make the decision? Well, they may have been relying too much on the systematic or central routes of persuasion, relying on people to engage with information and then logically reach the conclusion that they should act in a certain way. But that didn't work out. And part of that is because it didn't consider the cultural context. Now, doing both is going to be most beneficial. We need to recognize, part of this whole recognition is, in fact, just noting that we have bounded rationality. Right? We may think we're being very logical, but there are a lot of internal biases. There's a lot of cognitive shortcuts. These kinds of cognitive shortcuts are often discussed. This is the second time bringing up evolutionary psychology in this lecture, but as programs, right? The evolutionary psychologists say, well, these are like, they're patterns, they're schema or schemata that we have learned over millennia, and they're built into who we are in our DNA, just in terms of how our brains work, like they're central programming, right? And so whether or not you like evolutionary psychology is kind of irrelevant. We want to recognize that our brains have certain patterns that they like to follow in building associations, and we can't always process everything logically. Again, if you'll indulge a little more evolutionary psychology, they would say, like, if you hear a bush that you're walking by kind of rattle, it startles you and you jump away. It doesn't matter if it was a squirrel or a poisonous snake if you successfully avoid it, right? If you don't jump out of the way and it's a dangerous snake, well, that's a problem, right? So that's kind of the logic behind this approach to why we have cognitive shortcuts. All you really need to know about that is that we're not always totally rational. And rather than being like, wow, we're so stupid, we have to recognize that this is part of our nature. And so that might be a good reason for us to leverage multiple routes of persuasion, such as these. It's safest to use both routes / evidence and situate that as culturally as you can. So if you're going to use heuristic cues, we shouldn't just rely on those kinds of cues, but we should consider their role in messaging. So if I go into a culture where a doctor is heavily respected and I'm wearing a lab coat, that might help a little bit. But if I go into a culture where they don't trust Western doctors and I'm wearing a lab coat, that might hinder. It's a simple example, but you get the idea here. We got to consider the cultural context. So here's the picture that I decided on for our whole class. And this is a couple of screenshots from an app that my brother worked on, actually. And this is a culturally relevant intervention, or at least it was intended to be. It had some pretty good results, but it's a fish consumption app for the Great Lakes Anishinaabe tribe, the Ojibwa. The Laurentian Great Lakes Anishinaabe are traditionally a subsistence fishing culture. Fish is a very important part of their diet and their traditions. But there are risks associated with different species of fish. There are stratified risks depending on your sex and your age, in particular because women of reproductive age are going to be more sensitive to mercury. Well, they aren't. But if you're having a baby and you're growing another human inside of you, well, it matters how many contaminants are being exposed to. So that's what we would call a stratified risk in this case. But at any rate, this is designed to give people individualized health information. It's technical, but we're situating it. You can see aesthetic cues here, and you can also see both a quote realistic rendition of the walleye and northern pike over here, but you also have a more traditional art style. This is kind of the woodland art style that's associated with the traditional subsistence fishing culture and the Anishinaabe worldview, right? And so this app was designed to leverage both the technical information, artistic representation, but also the culturally situated artistic representation, and including the Ojibwa words for the fish and the Ojibwa words for the lakes and things like that. And so anyway, we're talking about culturally relevant, culturally situated health messaging that is relying on both central and peripheral routes of persuasion. It should target those multiple routes of persuasion. That will be more successful on the long run. It's considering that cultural context, whether it's socio-political or cultural practices, or the gatekeepers who allow access of outsiders to the rest of the community, or the respected members of that community whose message, from whom, if the message comes from them, it will be better received. We want to consider all of this in the cultural relevance of health interventions. We're just scratching the surface of the iceberg here, as it were, but hopefully this gives us a little bit of consideration in terms of how to make health communication more culturally relevant and therefore more successful. Thanks. I'll see you next time.